complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
All right, gentlemen, somewhat different stream tonight. I have two returning guests that I want to speak about a shared topic. So you're no doubt familiar with Bagby. He's been on my show a number of times. An Athenian Stranger is someone I had on roughly a month ago. Had a very good conversation. I encourage you guys to go out and check my backlog with both of these gentlemen. But Athenian Stranger spoke to a friend of mine last things, and they specifically talked about kind of the conditions on the ground working in education. And not only am I going to recommend that podcast, but when I was listening to it, I noticed a commonality, both in perspective on pedagogy and also in kind of the situations in which they left that segment. And so I decided it would be a really interesting conversation to kind of cross streams and have Bagby and Athenian Stranger talk about their common experience in education. So again, speaking generally, Bagby, how would you describe your experience teaching and what led you to leave?
I have thought about this quite a bit, especially because of the traumatic circumstances of my last departure. My own take is that I thought that I was doing one thing, and it turned out the people that hired me had expected me to be doing something else, namely just building respectable bourgeois kids with respectable bourgeois ideas. And I thought that I was there to teach American history and Homer, basically. And I ended up upsetting people. And my reflection is that I didn't really know my audience. I really didn't understand who I was talking to. And I guess I've done a lot of soul searching about that ever since the occasion. But in the midst of my teaching, I had a couple of experiences where I realized that my students really did not believe in values. They didn't think that beauty and ugliness were actually real things that could be objectively known and identified. They didn't believe that there were duties and social functions that they were called to perform and participate in. And more disturbingly, I realized that their parents and the actual administrators of the school didn't seem to believe in those things either. And that ended up working out to my grief. But I saw it coming from some distance away, and I tried to compensate uh, to preserve my position. But the short of it was, it didn't work. But what makes me so interested in talking with Athenian this evening is he and I both described this the same way. I wrote an essay many years ago that I published on a small website. It's probably still out there. I called it Nihilism in the 10th Grade. And Athenian has also been talking about nihilism as the default mindset of our age. And I encountered that while teaching, and that's the special challenge, I think, of teaching now. We have to we have to take a stand in the objective reality of values, functions, roles, hierarchy, heroism. All of these things are real. All of these things are necessary to teach, to learn, to live a meaningful life.
So, Athenian, I'm going to pose the same question I did to Bagby. What is your kind of path through teaching, and how did you come to leave it, at least in the formal sense?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with what Bagby had says there. I mean, one of the things that you have to account for is the the kind of students that you're dealing with. Because on the one hand, you do have this thing that we would otherwise refer to as civil education, right? That's going to be like the public schools. And then you have the kind of things like the charter schools or the classical schools, which we would think of more appropriately in terms of like elite education. And so it's going to depend on what kind of teaching environment you're in as to the extent to which you're going to be overwhelmed by the seemingly just impossible conditions that Bagby just outlined there. I mean, on the one hand, at many of the well, I don't want to drift into the broad thing. I'll simply say this: what I discovered to my surprise was that even the best young students at some of these great book schools, they were already so indoctrinated to the belief of what we would think of as people call it being woke or what have you. That's just a fancy way. That's a euphemism of nihilism. I mean, it's, you know, the extent to which one is going to go down the nihilistic road with the woke stuff is going to vary. But that's really all it is. We're talking about nihilism. And I was just very surprised to see the most talented students that anyone could ever hope for. Uh, I mean, just supremely talented. And they were already, in the most important respects, lost. I mean, I mean, there's nothing you can, there's nothing an educator can really do at the front of the classroom anymore when they, so there was a time when, I guess, I don't want to put too many years on this, but not long ago. And a lot of stuff about the LGBTQ stuff was floating around. And I had just mentioned in class that teachers already have too much to teach on their plate. And so expecting them to be up to speed with all this other stuff was just insane. I mean, there's already too much that needs to be taught throughout the entire year for every single day. And what that resulted in was me having to me being reduced to have to sit into a conference with a student who was sobbing because it had upset her so much, just to even say something like that. And this was not long ago, but it was prior to, I guess, the COVID stuff, just briefly prior to the COVID stuff, which is when everything really went bad. But that circumstance was really kind of amazing because the administration was okay with it. Um, they were fine with those kind of reactions from the students. And again, I mean, I just sort of want to emphasize these are the best quality students that you would want. And it was like that all the way across the board. And in many cases, they really did believe that they were Christians. They had this problem that we face in modernity of liberalism masquerading as Christian virtues. And
Absolutely.
that's a different discussion, but that's the issue. And then and if you just go from there to like the public schools, I mean, my God, I honestly can't even imagine people who teach in public schools. It's just so bad. But yeah, I mean, that's so that was my encounter with it, was to see that you could have students at even a high school level who were studying things like calculus 3, who had 4 or 5 years of Greek and Latin. They were winning state competitions in these things routinely, back to back. And even they were reduced to sobbing children if you said that you had too much to teach, in addition to to all this nihilistic woke stuff.
So one of the things that I think would be useful in this, and again, I know more about Bagby's situation just because one, I was there, and two, we've been friends for a long while. But Bagby, I remember that you had a lot of problems, particularly with parents. And so one of the blessings of private education is that you have more parental buy-in than the public school system, right? You'll hear public school teachers say things like, well, I will call the parents to inform them about a behavioral issue, and the parents either don't care or can't be reached, or just completely checked out. They expect, the schools to do everything. But Bagby, one of the things that you have mentioned is that sometimes the parents almost become a detriment to the education of their child. They become too involved. Am I correct in that?
Yes, and yeah, I know what you're referring to.
And so
Um, I'm
could you
I'm
explore that topic?
sure. Um, the parents, generally speaking, and I've only taught in classical Christian schools. That's the only kind of school I've ever taught in. So they were explicitly Christian, of a conservative bent. They were non-sectarian, really. They were ecumenical. But these are all people that identify with the school's mission on some level. Um, but I remember on a couple of occasions I had a parent that was extremely upset because in the course of making a review for a test, I was inspired by C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, which talks about discerning between values in the arts and the necessity of teaching a difference in values and the objectivity of these values, right? That there is a real thing called beauty, and that we can know something about this and we're supposed to like it, right? And it's not just a subjective whim. And I was making an example to my students in the course of the test review, because this was actually the original lesson in that literature class. I said, so it's like um, some guy claims to enjoy Dum Dum lollipops best, and his peer prefers eating a dinner of steak and potatoes and green beans. And so one of them is actually getting an objectively valuable meal, and the other one is getting something that honestly doesn't taste all that good to begin with, and pleases only the lower sensations of mere sweetness. And I said, this is comparable to things like music and literature. There are things that we read that don't deserve to survive even the day, like a newspaper. We throw away the newspaper at the end of the day because it's not worth keeping, it's not worth referencing. More often than not, it's not worth remembering. Um, and we don't throw away Shakespeare. We keep Shakespeare and we read him again and again and again, and he gets better and better, and we send him thousands of years into the future because he's permanently valuable and he's one of the best things ever. And we can actually know the difference between those things. But then I crossed a line and got in trouble. And I said, Bach is worth your time. You can devote your life to studying Johann Sebastian Bach, and that is not at all wasteful. That's actually a worthy use of your life. But Lady Gaga is trash and doesn't deserve anyone's attention. Well, I actually just picked a name out of a hat. I don't know anything about Lady Gaga. I never claimed to know anything about Lady Gaga. All I knew is that she was a trash singer. And I also made a calculated bet in the moment that any parent in that school would back me up and would not want their children listening to Lady Gaga. Well, the musical reference upset the students very much. It animated them highly. One of them even said to me, yeah, you can say that about books because we don't care. You say that about music, that's something we care about. We're not going to let you get away with that. You're saying that we have bad taste? And of course, that was provocative and naive on my part. I shouldn't have gone there. I should have left well enough alone and said a steak dinner is objectively better than Dum Dum lollipops. And Shakespeare is objectively better than USA Today. But I went to another field and I ticked them off. Well, what I didn't expect was interactions with parents afterwards. I talked with several parents afterwards who were upset because they believed the same thing that their high school students did, that there are no values in the arts, and it's politically problematic to say so. It makes you authoritarian to say that there are objective values that can be known, and some things are worth teaching, and some things are worth throwing away. So that became the Lady Gaga incident. I'll never forget, I had a mother, a very concerned, very engaged mother of a very talented student, a student that knew well enough to know that she was deliberately making trouble for my life by sicking her mother on me. Her mother came in and said she didn't know anything about Lady Gaga, but she was going to recommend Lady Gaga to all of her children and get them to listen to it just to prove that she was not a bigot like me. So you got to be careful. I thought that everybody knew stuff like this, but that shows just how much of a nerd I am. I'm not talking to these people. I didn't know who my audience was, and that's how I got in trouble.
So Athenian, is there kind of a similar pattern you've noticed with a rebellion against value claims? Did you see that as well in teaching?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. The immediate problem, though, just listening to when Bagby was talking about that, because I had problems with parents are a mixed bag. Some are going to be fair and they're going to recognize that their kids are still kids and they're going to listen to the adults about their kids. But then there are a large majority of them, and this gets more problematic with the more education that the kids have. The issue is that parents find it very, very difficult to believe that their student, their child, who has been making amazing grades at these very good schools, could ever be wrong in their assessment of a situation with a teacher or something like that. And I honestly don't know how to overcome that. I mean, it's the strangest thing. I mean, it's sort of what I had mentioned to last things in our discussion, is that in many cases, when you have these students, particularly the ones who are making the best grades and showing the greatest promise, when they go down this road of the nihilism that Bagby is talking about there, it's very difficult for their parents to believe that their own children are fighting against the very virtues that they as parents would like to see instilled in their children. They just can't believe it. I mean, they honestly cannot believe it. And it would not be until they've already gone off to college and then, come back home or something like that, and have already just completely outed themselves as far as how radical they are or something, or against their own parents, things like calling their own parents racists or bigots or things like that. Only then will the parents still not turn against their children, but just kind of wonder what happened, right? And so that's the biggest obstacle. And I honest to God, I don't know how that gets fixed, because parents are so disconnected from the reality of what's going on in the education of their children with the reality that's recognized by, I mean, the number is getting smaller and smaller, but the reality of what the teachers are recognizing is wrong with the kinds of instruction or the kinds of things that are happening with the students and stuff.
I think that there's an additional level to that, and I can just speak from my experience as perhaps the person who's most recently gone through education, and I think that it's sort of a problem between stated and revealed preference, right? Which is that on one hand, there's this kind of stated preference that, oh, I want my children to receive, education in the great books. I want them to be connected to a tradition. And that's something said, but what is meant seems to be, I want my children to be intelligent, to do well, to receive good grades, and to get into, a prestigious university. And, while certainly there is a crossover between, learning your lessons well and later achievement, there is a problem. And I even remember this, as a high achieving student, where I would get very, very angry if I didn't get, marks above a certain level. And there's this ongoing problem of grade inflation that we see at sort of every level of the education system, right? It's rampant in higher education, obviously also in public education. So it creates this market pressure to conform, right? Because there's always that worry that, oh, if my kid has a B minus average from a school where they follow a standard bell curve, that will disadvantage them compared to the kid who's getting an A at the school where everyone gets A's. And so Bagby, I'm curious, did you notice a problem with grading students appropriately in your own work?
Oh, good heavens. This became such a major problem in my experience that when I had a case of clear plagiarism or a student that fell well short of the standards of the project, just gave nonsensical answers to, paragraph questions or something like that. If I thought that, well, if I wanted to give an F, I would second guess myself. Do I really want to go through that experience again of giving an F? Do I really want to deal with the phone calls, the meetings, the questioning by my superiors, the demands to defend my decision? I got to the point my last couple of years in one of my positions that I would go and see the school counselor and explain my decision to the school counselor. And then I would go and see my dean of my department and explain my position. And I would get them both to sign off on the F before I gave an F. And you're absolutely right. Especially in private education, I think where parents are paying a lot of money for their children to go to the local prestigious school, they fully expect their children to go off to the state university like their father and grandfather did, or whichever prestigious arts school or wherever it is they have in mind. And if you deliver a grade that impacts their GPA, they think that you are failing on your side of a contract, that your contract is to deliver a diploma with the suitable honors for their kid to get the scholarship or the placement at the preferred institutions. And the parents would literally come to my classroom and tell me that to my face and say, well, they're supposed to go to such and such. They're supposed to get this program. Well, she's going to medical school, and she's a sophomore who is not doing particularly well in science either. Because I talked to the science professor and we commiserate. We have the same problems. It's a huge problem. But to speak to what Athenian was just talking about, they're going off to school. They are blooming into woke radicals in these state schools. They're even becoming the woke radicals at the conservative Christian schools. I know because I went to one, and those are my classmates. I'm one of the few people from my set that is a professed vocal Christian at this stage in my life, like 20 years after graduation. Most of them aren't. Most of my classmates are not. Most of them have become atheists or agnostics, and they went to Christian schools their whole lives, went to a Christian college at great expense to their parents. My final year at one institution, I remember well, the headmaster had realized this was a huge problem. And to his credit, he assembled us all and talked to the faculty and staff several times. He said, our students are going off to college and they are turning and denouncing this institution online. They are calling out their teachers and calling their teachers racists and bigots online. And they're renouncing the faith that we have always taught them in this institution. And that was all that we wanted for them, was to remain Christians. And he said, we are not serving them right. We are doing something wrong. And I was very quiet. I was talking to my friends about this, and I said, when will we stop sending them to college? When will we stop sending them to these colleges? And I've got a very controversial take on that. I think it's probably better not to go to college if it means that you can live a halfway normal life and start a family and raise kids and have a job. Maybe it's better not to go to college. Maybe it's better to put the whole thing underground. And I realize that's a very radical take, and I understand the arguments against my position there. But that's where I was when I left that school. I wasn't even willing to say that to the headmaster, but that's what I was thinking. You are pushing all these kids into the very schools that sabotage the mission and everything you say that you believe in, so that they come and attack you and endanger your standing in your community. But our situation is pretty bad as far as the takeover of the institutions and how well honed they are in turning the young against everything traditional and hierarchical. That's a very real problem.
So, Athenian, is there something in that sort of meshes with your experience?
Yeah, I was over here getting anxiety to press the unmute button because I wanted to second so strongly what Bagby was mentioning there. One of the greatest problems that I came to discover, and this is just something that often I think educators just have to live through. It's hard for me to imagine. Well, let me just state it. When it comes, especially, for instance, to the great books, we want so badly to share the greatness that we have found in them with others. And we have, what Nietzsche would call the it was, right? The past looming over us. And we often think to ourselves, oh man, if I had just been reading this earlier, if I'd have got an earlier start on it, I'd have even gone so much further. And we come to believe that we can just teach these things to younger students and it will work out all that much better for them. And this is, of course, well, I say of course, but many people don't realize this. This is where there's a big difference between good books and great books. Younger students only need good books. They don't need the great books. The great books, Traffic and Dynamite, these are the greatest thinkers of our Western heritage. They are wrestling with things like atheism, nihilism, all these things. Even in something which would be as seemingly uncontroversial as Plato's Republic. But you teach that to young, impressionable students that are, 16, 17, 18. What I've found more than anything is that their tendency is to think that they've understood these things properly and now they're ready to move on to other things, right? Whatever's latest is greatest. That's what college gives them. And that seems to be the biggest problem there is you have to be very, very careful introducing these kinds of things to young students. I mean, young kids in high school, they'll love Dostoevsky, right? They'll love, they'll just love him. It's just everyone loves Dostoevsky, especially because they're all going through this existential angst, right? Nobody understands me, or oh, I love this person, but they don't love me back. I have my first heartbreak, But I'm no longer certain of that, but what I'm even more certain of is that we lack the quality of teachers that are even competent to be able to teach these things. I mean, you have to really, really know what you're dealing with here to be able to properly teach these things. And unfortunately, what it does, like I said, I mean, especially the kind of the great books programs that teach young students in a seminar format, right, where they all kind of, they circle the classroom itself is one big, like, table, right, circular table where there's a kind of presumed equality or something between the all the students and even the teacher. They're really not even considered teachers. They just kind of guide the discussion, the so-called Socratic method. All of that is an absolute disaster because it teaches these young people that uh, they have now entered into the world of adults. Their opinions matter. Uh, they can speak with other adults as if they themselves are also at perhaps even that level or even at a higher level, right? And all these things come together, and it's just an enormous disaster. And the headmasters of these schools, typically, I mean, you're never going to get them to even understand this because they honestly believe that, how could what they've dedicated their life to have gone so wrong? And so it's exactly like what Bagby said. I mean, I remember when the George Floyd thing happened, one of the schools that I had been associated with, they flatly had to turn the comments off to their website because all of their students were just trashing the hell out of them as being a bunch of racists, uh, teaching nothing but, white man stuff. And of course, they're all white. I mean, it's just absolutely the insanity. And the school buckled, of course. The schools always buckle. Um, just I'm trying not to be too black pilling here, but I mean, there is a way out of this. I will simply say this to your audience: there is a way out of this. It's just it's sort of like what Bagby was saying, but also along with the education and everything that needs to be changed quite a bit for a lot of these so-called classical schools or great book schools. I mean, because there truly is a disconnect. It's like what we've seen with the so-called boomers or the face normie people on Twitter, that they want to be on our side. They have a little bit of an understanding of how bad things are, but they still somehow end up on the side of believing that it's not as bad as we've told them or something like that. They think that systems can be fixed from still within the system, reform them, and things like that. Getting them to understand that these things require a fundamental rethinking at the foundational level. That's very, very difficult. But people should also understand it shouldn't be assumed that it's an easy thing. I mean, again, we're literally talking about the greatest thoughts and ideas that our entire history as a people has bequeathed to us. So it really, it's more of a kind of me problem as opposed to a them problem, right? We don't understand how powerful the stuff is that we traffic in, and so of course we fail to understand how dangerous it can be when it apparently goes wrong.
So there are several things there in what you've both just said that I want to address. The first one is sort of this, and there have been different terms used to describe it, right? Some will call these people hick libs, right? And that describes something slightly different, but it's the same idea, right? Someone who is from an ostensibly, right-leaning conservative background, who has religious parents, who's gone to a religious institution, who sort of becomes an arch apostate, right? Who sort of revels in turning over to the other team. I know half a dozen of these people who've, graduated from the program that I did, who've sort of, made it a part of their identity to kind of like turn around and attack those people. So that's something I want to address. Maybe put a pin in that. But in what you said, Athenian, there's also this problem of presumed equality, right? Equality between parents, between teachers, even between subject matter. And so, Bagby, I'm curious, what do you see as being the correct relationship between a student and a teacher? Like, what is that ideally constituted as?
Well, it's a conundrum for us because it involves explicit distinction and hierarchy. I resonate completely with what Athenian was saying about the the discussions with the students where there is a presumed equality with the student. I was always resisting that kind of mode of teaching. I did it as a matter of course because it was required of me, but I always tended to turn it into a seminar style. So we would discuss literature, and I would lead them to responses. You know, I'd hear their responses, and then I would correct them and get them back on track. Was how I preferred to do it. But this is what is so hard about this in education. Our education system is built on the romantic assumption that uncultivated people have better insight than cultivated people. It's the myth of the noble savage, and this is deeply rooted in the Western education system at this point. Education colleges teach this everywhere. Um, if you want a good primer about what goes on in education college, there's a delightful book. I mean, it's horrifying and frightening, but it's also hilarious in its own sick way. It's called Ed School Follies. I forget who wrote it, but my goodness, you'll get your fill of that, and that's why I never bothered with any education classes, because it's theory and it's very ephemeral and it's by its nature very romantic and contrary to all concepts of hierarchy. So hierarchy means that the teacher knows his subject and the students don't, which means that the teacher needs to get that knowledge into his students somehow, and the students need to respect the teacher for knowing what he's talking about. To say that one group of people are better in any way than another group of people, that's been anathematized in our society, which is why we aren't able to talk about this inequality clearly. Um, this is undemocratic. Literally, that this is what the education people will say, that they believe in democratic education, and that means participatory, like everyone's on the same level. They believe in equality in education. And that means so many different things to them. But one of the things it means is that the teacher is on the same level as the students, and maybe the teacher should be learning from the students, you know. These romantic inspired youngsters can grab Homer and see something that someone who's been studying him for his adult life has never seen before, and will change the teacher's life, right? Ed school people actually talk this way, and it's balderdash. This isn't how it works, and it turns the world of learning on its head. So as far as what to do about this, we basically have to cultivate students from a young age, and this is very conducive with raising children to begin with, that they are to respect their elders. And in classical education in particular, and that's, you know, sort of education that reads the great books, that's interested in Plato and Aristotle, and um, trains the students typically in Latin at least. This is a very old style of education. This is traditional education. This is actually normal education. This is the way all Western education used to be. Now it's just a special set of schools that attempt it anymore. Most schools don't even attempt this anymore. Um, but a basic lesson that should be in there from the very beginning would be the humility of Socrates. What is wisdom? Receptivity, the the knowledge that you don't know anything. And that is the proper attitude for the students to have. They ought to, and they need to recognize the hierarchy of their teachers, that their teachers can actually tell them something they don't know about, and they need to respect their elders. We want our students to do that anyway. We want all of our children to do that anyway. They must respect their parents before they go to school so that they can respect other adults and they know what that's like.
So, Athenian, Is there something that you see as well with this sort of democratic idea of education?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's something to be said about a seminar format on occasion, but what I've come to think more than anything, and especially when you're dealing with people who have spent their whole lives studying these topics, this of course segues into the discussion about simply needing better qualified teachers to teach these kinds of things if you're going to teach them. But there's something to be said about an instructor just saying, okay, class, you're all going to sit back, basically shut up and take notes from what I have to say to you about all these things, because I have so much to say that if I were to simply guide whatever questions you have, your questions simply are not going to even get, for the most part, even into the ballpark of where we need to go. I mean, and so there's a way that this can be handled uh, from day to day, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be something set in stone. That's the way that the class is conducted constantly. But I mean, the fact is that you are not going to produce students who recognize hierarchies if they themselves are not subject to hierarchies, and in particular within the classroom. One of when I was in the math PhD program before I switched to philosophy, my advisor was French, and he used to tell me he used to always complain that American students are just so lazy and coddled. And he said, you know, when I was in France, they assign us with every time they give us an exam, they hand back the exams in order of who did best first, all the way down to who did worst. And that also uh, puts you in the order of where you're going to sit in the class. He said, so you never wanted to be embarrassed in front of your colleagues by having to sit at the very back or something like that, or being the last person to receive your test. And I think,
Magnifique.
yeah, I think right about now, America could use a healthy dose of that kind of. On the one hand, yes, it is shame, and there should be no problem with adults saying that shame is very instructive in a pedagogical sense. Of course, no one will say it. But the other side to that is honor, right? I mean, where there's shame, there's also honor. And so it's you teach young people to pursue honor uh, only by way of these kinds of hierarchies and things like that. But seeing that kind of stuff happen today, it just no one does it. I mean, there's this race to kind of embrace mediocrity and slap an A to it or something like that and say, good enough, good enough. We'll leave the fundamental problems there to your teacher next time. You know.
So
I wanted to bring this up with you, Athenian, if you don't mind me asking something, Jay.
no, not at all. Carry on.
Um, I realized it, strangely enough, my last day in the classroom, I realized that I was basically giving my students, in summary of Homer's Odyssey, I was giving them a a uh, a final peroration on the authoritarian personality and recommending it to them. Now, I had given this lecture many times previously. I've been teaching Homer for 9 years at that point, and I had given the same recommendations to my students over and over and over again. It was only my very last year, my very last occasion to lecture in the classroom, that I was dealing with people accusing me of all sorts of things. And I had come to realize, wow, this is actually what Adorno was condemning as the root of fascism. But it was shame, honor, hierarchy, and heroism. Those were my talking points for Homer to my 10th grade students. And I was telling them that this is where the best satisfaction in life comes from, recognizing these values realizing that these things motivate human beings even to die. These are the strongest possible motivations and satisfactions that we can have. And it's knowing one's place in the social order. It's knowing one's role in society. It's embracing those roles, um, as a man, as a woman, as a husband, a wife, a father, a mother, a friend, a subordinate, a lieutenant. Those are where we find the greatest satisfaction in life. We turn back and look at those things and say, I did that. I was a father. I was a son. I was faithful to these trusts. And that is one of the best things we can look for. Of course, this is all condemned in the mid 20th century, and this has become extremely current. Um, it's called out, and people that say these things are called all the usual terms and canceled for it. This is one of the great values of teaching classical literature, is that we teach these things because they're so consistent, so universal. But you were saying honor and shame. They're absolutely necessary for society. They're absolutely necessary for education. And they need to be part of our institutions to restore their function and value. We want value, we must measure the quality of things. And some are excellent and some fall short. And some are very bad. They are failures. They get F's, right? Um, these things are so very valuable, and we've feminized our education. We are so afraid of hurting people. Harm is the worst evil that we can do, to make people feel bad. That's going to traumatize them, and then they're going to talk about that with all of their dates for the rest of their lives, right? um, we need stronger virtues motivating the values of our institutions, and how we order things in our institutions.
Yeah, let me just add real quickly here too, so that we don't have to. A lot of times you'll hear people complain that even the word honor itself is like this old-fashioned word. Uh, in the Platonic dialogues, for instance, in Plato's Laws, the primary discussant, he flatly says, he goes, we're in the realm of praise and blame. Like that's what honor and shame is. It's just the extent to which we praise people versus the extent to which we blame them. And I think when people realize that that's the that's the level of foundation that we're at with honor and shame, is simply talking about being able to properly praise or properly blame someone. I mean, that's what we've lost. That should really make people's eyes open and sort of ask themselves, well, hell, if you can't even talking about if you can't talk about
That's all
proper.
connected with this root of nihilism that both of us have been talking of independently of each other. We find we're speaking the same language on this. If nothing is praiseworthy and nothing is blameworthy, then we fundamentally lose meaning. We don't know how to act. Everyone is an A. Everyone gets a prize. Nobody feels like they're falling short. You get the participation trophy. And that's very much our situation, as much of a commonplace observation as that is. That truly is how our schools tend to work. And I'm not coming from the public school system. I'm not coming from a the mainstream. I'm coming from elite schools. I'm coming from small schools with special missions that are trying to do it differently. And though they might talk this way on occasion, this isn't actually how things work. They are part of their society. Um, it's my society too. I know these things rub up on me, but this is it's a deep problem, and we struggle against it. It's hard to find communities where we can do better than this, and we can all be on the same page, because you might set up an institution, but if you open its doors to people that you don't know, they're going to come into this. And if you have systems of shame and honor in your school, this is something that gets a lot of pushback. I remember my first years teaching. I had a particularly great administrator, a very masculine dean, who was very physical, very demanding, um, had a very strong sense of honor, and when he was particularly good with the boys, not surprisingly. And this made a tremendous difference in the spirit of the school and the operations of the school. If boys acted up, if they forgot to do one of their duties, like if they forgot to raise the flag in the morning, for instance, or they were caught acting up or doing something they shouldn't, they would go into the courtyard and do push-ups, and they would go into the field and they would run sprints until they were gasping for breath. And this was a form of punishment, but also a form of spectacle. Like the other students would watch them do this. And this made them shape up and behave themselves. And this dean got major complaints. I remember there were complaints on the school website for a while. People were coming in, people that had been a part of the school, I presume, because they knew details they couldn't know otherwise, would complain and say, "Well, he's too hard on the students. He's abusive. He makes them ashamed." And these were all charges that eventually came to a head, and he was forced to resign. And this was a kind of disgrace, and this was something that those of us who loved him, felt really terrible about afterwards. Um, but that's an example of just how hard this can be. Every society has social norms, and if you step outside of those social norms, you do get ostracized. And that proves a very great difficulty for platform communities, people that we can trust, where we can do this better, when all it takes is one dissenter to call us out, and they'll call down the wrath of the community on us, and we will be scapegoated.
And I think that speaks to a broader problem, which is, where do these people who run these institutions derive their principles from? Because it goes back to that concept I mentioned earlier about the difference between stated and revealed preference. Because the stated preference is, oh, we are indexing with a broader tradition, right? Reforming this chain of being that goes from the roots of Western civilization, rebuilding something new in the modern era. And yet they've adopted the same value system as the culture they claim to oppose. And so, you mentioned this dean who, I certainly loved. It's funny you mentioned doing sprints, or of the several times I can remember actually throwing up from exercise, he was involved in almost all of them. And in each case, I thoroughly deserved it. But nonetheless, right, that is a situation in which there is a stated preference for Western civilization, right? A stated preference for a masculine understanding of the world. But, when you have that like claimed value, but sort of produce the fruit of, a feminized, liberalized culture, it sort of brings up the question is, where do your loyalties truly stand? Athenian, I'm curious, do you see anything in that idea of feminization?
Yeah, the most successful space I ever did on Twitter was about gynocracy and discussing the philosophical origins of this role of effeminacy. I'm doing a follow this Friday. I was speaking with so I have a really good friend, my mutual Alejandro. I was talking with him about this today, and one of the things that simply has to be addressed, but I mean, no one really will ever talk about it, because again, this is one of the idols, the sacred taboo idols of the left, but in many cases of the right too, and this is a problem. I was asking Alejandro, I said, how did it come to be that the vast majority of teachers for high school, for instance, are all women. What was there before that? Because anyone who's watched some of the old TV shows or something like that, they see where there's, even in America, right, there was just a schoolhouse and it was a schoolmaster, and he was usually male, and he was given the great authority of the community. They all looked up to him, they trusted him. And I just asked Alejandro, I was like, what? It's like, did it just happen because we've just made education so popular that, I mean, everyone has to be educated, right? I mean, how did this happen? And this is something we're working on. But the fact that there are no very good male role models in the position of, for instance, high school teachers, that's a serious problem. I mean, that is a very serious problem, because of all the things that can be taught to young, impressionable boys, there are many that are significant and definitive that a woman simply cannot teach. And simply saying that, really upsets a lot of people, but that's just the way it is. There are things that young boys grow up having to deal with that women simply never face. Something as simple as knowing that at recess or something, they're going to have to face the school bully and possibly get into a fist fight. That's something to them. That's what we're used to be.
Well, it's rather like boys growing up without fathers, and the emasculating effect this has on them, the debilitating effect it can have on most, right? We have examples of people that have overcome this, but the idea is that this is a serious challenge for a boy to grow up without a male role model to challenge him and guide him and serve as a model for him of good behavior. I also see this as a major factor in where we are in our education, that it's become a nurturing profession, and it's attracted women in profusion. I don't think that that's particularly difficult at lower levels. I think that that is all natural. But when it comes to finishing people into adulthood, when it comes to mature students, I, I I agree with you. And traditionally, the schoolmaster was a male role. You read about tutors and men that ran schools in England and things like that, and it is disproportionately male and also very entrepreneurial. But I'm thinking of positive examples, because I don't want to be just handing out black pills here. The best examples that I'm aware of are single sex schools, and in particular, people have who've decided to do something more radical as far as their pedagogy and setting and terms. So there is a particularly wonderful school, certainly looks that way to me, up in rural Pennsylvania. I think it's called St. Gregory the Great, and it's a Catholic boys boarding school, and it's in a rural setting, and they have a special buy-in. These boys go there. I don't know how many grades it is. It's not K through 12. They start in middle school at the earliest, and they have nothing electronic. They have no screens. They have nothing recorded. And this means that if they want entertainment, they must produce it themselves. So they produce plays and they play music. There's physical activity because the setting is on a farm. There's daily worship. They're all Catholic. And there is a buy-in. Um, I I don't know much about this. I don't know anyone at this institution. I've just read about it and I found it inspirational. But I think that our example of the disciplinarian at the school would fit in well in that environment. It's a male environment, um, and men need challenges and men need discipline, and the physicality of that is something that men generally accept. It seems to me that that would work in such an environment. But better than that is they are disconnecting from screens. They are not on screens. They are in the books, and they are forced to produce things for themselves. Now, the downside here, and this is back to our original problem, perhaps, the parents that I had problems with, they wanted their students that they wanted their children to grow up like them. They wanted their children to have lives like them, convictions like their own. And the parents that came in protesting on grounds that, oh, well, you aren't training my kids to be a nihilist, right? I have a problem with that. Um, those people want to be normies more than anything else, and they realize that if they embrace anything outside of that, or their children do, their children are choosing an alternative lifestyle in our world that means serious social disadvantages, at least potentially. There are ways to hedge against this and guide your way through it, but if we were to found a boys' school and ban computers and cell phones and have a disciplinary environment, well, we maybe we could produce lots of engineers out of a school like this, and they wouldn't have to worry about their the way that they differ from the mainstream of society because they're in such high demand. That wouldn't matter, right? And they wouldn't be talking about things they believe. But I understand parents looking at the likes of me. I understand they wouldn't necessarily want their son to have my disadvantages in this world. I get that. I have certain skills and I'm making my way, but it's been difficult. Um, so that's an aspect to it as well, like to appeal to a broad enough community so that you can have a school that is sustainable. You have to appeal to you have to appeal to common denominators. You can't propose to make these students misfits in the modern world. That's not going to fly with many people. It'll appeal to a minority for sure, people like us. That's exactly what we would want. But you see, that practical aspect, I technically I was an administrator, but this was never a concern of mine. Um, private schools are businesses, and they have to have a certain amount of clientele. So that's part of the problem.
Well, I see sort of the issue being a desire to universalize education, right? Where education is viewed as, not something that was kind of reserved for a certain class of person. And I don't mean that entirely in the economic sense, but maybe, but it is something that was fundamentally elite. And again, the more mass market anything becomes, right, it must be dumbed down to reach a wider audience. And obviously, there's a balancing game to be played there. You're right; these institutions are businesses, but I think that there's perhaps a deeper question, right? Which is this relatively new idea of universal education? Well, how has that panned out for us? Right? Like roughly 1 in 3 Americans cannot read above an eighth grade level. You know, even if we consider that to be a kind of a minimum level to be educated, that does kind of bring up the question of like, well, what are we trying to do here? And are we sort of, this is a new system sort of wearing the face and wearing the trappings of an older one. And it's sort of this unholy amalgamation between the two. Athenian, do you have any thoughts on the kind of universal nature of education?
Yeah, I hope I'm not robot. I never know out here in the desert. Um, broadly speaking, this gets to the very, very important topic of citizenship, if people can even believe it. The whole purpose of citizenship, this is why Aristotle begins the Politics with a discussion of what citizenship entails. It used to be something that people would strive for and earned, something that they wanted to show their fellow citizens that they lived in their own life. When you dilute a people so much, or their understanding of their own politics so much, that to be a citizen means nothing, that's when you end up with guys like us, the nerds, kind of sitting around scratching our heads thinking, what, what's going wrong? Why can't our other, our colleagues and stuff read beyond the 8th grade level and things like this? We just don't have the kind of demands on ourselves as a people that we used to, because in the exact same way that you very rightly pointed out, that the more you mass market something, the more it has to be diluted. The same thing with what it means to even be a people, to be a country. The more that you make it available to anybody, the more that it begins to mean nothing. And that, again, let me just emphasize, this thing that we call education, or let me be more specific, public education, which is what we expect our citizens as a people to have, that comes into existence precisely when this thing that we call politics collides with this other thing that we call philosophy. And so what comes out of that is this thing that we call civil or public education. And no one wants to really have those discussions anymore. What, to the extent that anyone does have a discussion about those, what they have resulted in is this thing called departments of education at universities and stuff that teach that garbage pedagogy that Bagby was talking about earlier, that's absolutely worthless. The first thing that should be done, if anyone's serious about reforming education, is flatly destroy and dismantle the U.S. Department of Education and all the requirements that they have listed for teachers and things like that. But that's how this otherwise seemingly kind of a conversation between nerds really does unfold into everything, is how it is that we as a people have decided that we're going to answer the necessity of this question we face, of how it is that we combine, on the one hand, politics or governance with this other thing that we call philosophy. And that's really everything that comes tumbling out of this.
So Bagby and I had a conversation related to this just a few days ago. And it was connected to a story that was recently in the news. I'm going to mention it not because it's particularly important, because it's sort of a jumping off point for a discussion about citizenship. And that was recently a judge decided that illegal aliens, right, someone who is unlawfully entered the country, is not a citizen, has the right to own weapons under the Second Amendment. And Bagby, your response was, I think, particularly enlightened on that. You were talking about what historically was seen as the requirements for citizenship and how that kind of grants you certain rights. And you were particularly talking about property ownership. Do you remember that conversation?
Yes, I do. Yeah, this is the ancient exclusivity of citizenship, the connection of activity, participation, and ownership in citizenship, particularly like the ancient Greek republican ideals connected to this. The citizens own weapons, the citizens own property, the citizens are willing to sacrifice their lives for these things because they participate in these institutions. And we have adopted a radically different idea of citizenship very like you even see this in places like the Dred Scott decision right before the Civil War, where the Supreme Court rejects the idea of passive citizenship. And of course, if you know anything about the Dred Scott decision, you know that decision was repudiated with a constitutional amendment. Uh, and we now have, as part of our fundamental law and citizenship, where citizens don't have to participate at all. They don't have to own anything. They don't even need to speak the language. They don't even have to be familiar on the most basic level with the laws of the land. Evidently, they don't even have to obey the laws of the land. They can just come in and assume the citizenship and the rights thereof, right? With even outside of the law altogether. And this is a passive citizenship. The idea that citizens don't have to participate, they have no responsibilities. Presumably, they can be taxed if they fall into certain categories, but that's about it. And that's bizarre. Never in history has there been a republic that operated with such a bizarre idea of citizenship. Now, this is obviously connected with the idea of universal education. That as education is something that you should get. It's your birthright as a citizen to be educated, and people treat education like it's something that can be given, bestowed from on high. They treat it as an entitlement, and this is a very perverse view of something that you have to work to achieve. One of the better ideas that I ever encountered, when I was actually an administrator and I was having, strategic conversations with other administrators, one of the best ideas I encountered was a far-fetched idea, but I still loved it and would immediately implement it if we had the capital to rest on, was that all students in the high school should be invited. So we could have students come up through the middle school, and everybody knows that you've got to make a certain impression if you want to continue at the school. And students need to be invited into the last stage, into the high school level. Now, this could be done in a number of ways, right? You could have an honors level. You could have, the thesis class. You have to be invited to take the thesis.
Oh, Bagby, you've dropped out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you dropped off after saying invited to take the thesis class.
Yes. This would introduce hierarchy and honor into the program, and introducing those distinctions and hierarchy would do much to improve quality. And of course, you would not have to absorb your faculty with trying to get the lower tier students caught up constantly. And that would be better for everyone involved. The future of the country relies on how we are invested in the talented. We want to use our resources in education to enable them, not the lower rungs. And that is where most of the efforts of teachers come from. Now, I know I'm going to shock people by saying that, but it's true. Not all students are equally capable. Let's think of something that is easy to wrap our minds around. Mathematics. Not all students get algebra, say. Now, you are much better off focusing your resources on the students that do get algebra and preparing those students for calculus, and maybe much better off with the students that don't get the algebra, giving them something on a lower tier, math for liberal arts. Pass them on, finish math for liberal arts, don't take any more math, don't slow down the students in calculus, right? That is a sensible approach to a noble and complex subject. And the same standard lies in the other subjects. There is distinction and hierarchy. This is natural. All people fall into these levels of distinction and hierarchy. And if we are to run our education system's better, we ought to realize these things and follow it.
So we have a large number of super chats, and because many of them are questions and good questions, I want to give them their due. Obviously, if you'll have more questions, feel free to send them. But we have several from Takower on entropy. First one is just a comment, "Oh Captain, my Captain," a poem I believe I was forced to memorize. And then his next one is one that I want to ask you about, which is, can you each recall, and I'll throw this to Athenian first, a teacher that you were particularly influenced by and what made them great?
Yeah, I love talking about this because I think that it's just about one of the most important things concerning education or pedagogy in general. If you ask anyone to just name, for instance, like the 5 most influential people of their life, I guarantee you one of them is going to be a teacher. I mean, you could even probably put that at 3, right? Name the 3 most influential, and they'll probably name a teacher in there. Teachers are extremely influential in young people's lives and in a way that lasts the rest of their lives. Um, I was headed down the road of being just a nobody. I was not good in athletics. I was not good in school. I was just a wasted seat in the class. And I was at a very small country school, and we were out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I graduated with like just such a tiny class anyway. No, just the fact that any of us graduated was a good thing. Nothing much was expected of us. Half the school was illegal immigrants um, that never even spoke a word of English, I don't think, even after graduating. But I had this math teacher who was retired. He was a former coach, and he had retired in a different state and come to our state just so he could teach again. And he was just an inspirational guy. He was an old guy, and we were supposed to be learning math, and we did a little bit, but pretty much every day he just was kind of I don't want to say a motivational speaker because that demotes what he was doing, but he was a very, very decent man. He was a very pious man. He was just what you wanted in a father that was stern enough to tell you when you were being an idiot, but also you looked up to him because you wanted his approval, his praise. And because he was supposed to be teaching us math, and he just was able to reach into something right inside of me and just make me expect more of myself. One of the stories he used to always tell us was that, even if he would tell us, he said, even if all I did for the rest of my life was park cars, I would still be, every day I would go try to be the best of that I can be, because you never know who's watching. And in many respects, that's what your ethics are, is what you're doing when nobody's watching, how you conduct yourself. And that just really resonated with me to sort of expect more of myself. And so I took it on myself to learn the math that we were supposed to be learning, but no one really could. I mean, we were a bunch of country kids, country boys. But I went to a local bookstore and I bought some of those. The Research Education Association used to put out these books called like Teach Yourself Geometry or Teach Yourself Calculus and all that stuff. And so I just got a couple of those, had my parents get me a couple. All they are is, they're like 800 pages of nothing but problems and solutions. Like it's a problem, then they work it out, and it increases in difficulty. And I just remember I would spend, my weekends, the holiday breaks and stuff, while the rest of the family was watching movies and stuff. I'd be watching the movies with them, but I'd still be working these problems and stuff. And I just blew him away. I mean, he couldn't believe how much I had progressed just to do that. And I'd like to think that the kind of things that I do in my own style of instruction has that kind of an echo or that kind of an impression upon other people. So yeah, definitely.
I know exactly who fits the bill for this. A certain teacher I had my first year of college, and my education is kind of unique in that I was homeschooled all the way through, and my parents were really wonderful there are things they were strong on, and things that I wish I had more of coming out of the homeschool experience. But I went into honors programs. I got scholarships immediately. I was well prepared for college. But when I first started college, I picked out a bunch of random classes, and I just happened to sign up for English and Composition 101 and got a professor who profoundly changed my life. He had put together some essays in a little reader. We bought this reader. I remember it was my cheapest textbook. He had this thing bound. He might have bound it himself. I don't know. It was really simply done. It wasn't a durable thing. But I remember we read an excerpt from Thoreau's Walden in it. We read Plato's Crito. That was in that book. It's my first Platonic dialogue. Um, and he gave us readings, and we were to write essays on these things. And it was maybe after my first year. No, it was after my first semester. I realized he had a reading group, and I went to his reading group. And every once in a while, I'll still come across notes from his reading group. And he gave me very valuable judgments. I realized on a very profound level that he had understanding, he had a wisdom that I had never encountered. And I just sat in complete silence, hanging on his every word. And I would write down things that he said. This was the first time in my life I tried to take notes, because he was onto something and I did not know what it was. Like, most of the things he said, I did not understand. But I was captivated by the quality and the profundity. And I still have some of these notes. I still come across them to this day, and I try to reconstruct in my mind what was said at those book clubs, what was said those times that I was in conversation with him. One of the things he gave me that I will always remember, and something I try to pass on to my students every year that I taught, was a sense that there are durable pieces of literature
Bagby, yet again, I think you've dropped
and it
out at
will.
what was a poignant moment.
Oh,
The last
too
thing we
bad.
heard was there's literature, and then you dropped off.
Is literature that is a treasure for all time, and you are to find those things. And I think he mentioned the Penguin Classics, and it was at that point in my life I went to Barnes and Noble, and back then Barnes and Noble actually had all the Penguin Classics on one shelf. Incredible to think, isn't it? Barnes and Noble has changed so much. But I started buying Barnes and Noble, or buying the Penguin Classics at Barnes and Noble, and I wanted to identify classics. Like, what is a classic? What is a great book? And I didn't really know what I was after. All that I knew is I believed that there was excellence. There were artistic works that stood out, that were worth preserving, worth mastering, more than lesser things. And that vision of excellence, I don't know how he got that across to me, but that was one of the things that changed my life. He happened to be a traditional Christian as well, a liturgical Christian. And it was through him I discovered Luther's Shorter Catechism. I was a very low church Protestant, and I had never encountered a catechism. I had no idea what a catechism was. It stimulated my mind and encouraged my faith like few things I had ever encountered before. And through him, I encountered the creeds and the Book of Common Prayer. And I have loved those things for the rest of my life. it changed the way that I live. It changed the way that I related to God for the rest of my life. And he was my teacher. And God put me in his class. It was completely random, at least from one perspective, that I ended up with him. And I am so thankful for him.
Yeah, let me also just add real quickly. The reason that question is also very, very important is because the same way that people like myself and Bagby can recall those rare teachers that are able to really make a change in our life for the rest of our lives. That's the whole reason we have, for instance, the story of the Pied Piper. It only takes one charismatic bad teacher to really corrupt entire generations of students. And you can see this in America very, very easily. I could run down the list of these so-called public intellectuals who they're in academia, but you often wonder if they even teach anymore because they're always on the circuit, going off giving speeches and stuff. I mean, just think about who's that one guy, Chomsky. Uh, these kind of people that sort of roam around all the colleges, with their little fan clubs and stuff, preaching nihilism and things like that. So it's very important to understand that on the, it's a dual blade. On the one hand, you could really nail it and have an amazing teacher that can change your life in a really good way, but you could also have someone who's just flatly a corrupter of the youth and is very charismatic and is able to uh, corrupt entire generations of students for decades, really.
So Takar has a another interesting question, which is sort of the converse of that, which is, can you speak about your best students? What were the things that were good characteristics in people you taught? Bagby, do you want to handle this first?
Sure. I had students that were real self-starters. They aimed very high. They didn't really know what they were getting into, but they believed that there were big ideas out there that they wanted to grapple with. So I had students that came to me. They had the option to write on something for a composition class, and they came to me and they said, "Well, I want to write about this 19th century European leader." And I was really surprised at this, and said, "Yeah, I have sources on that. That's really interesting." Um, Secretly, I'm telling myself, really doesn't matter what he comes up with. It's going to be worth reading. That's going to be fun. Um, and I gave him a couple books, um, slapped him on the back, and said, "This is cool. This is ambitious. You go get that. That's good." And another student wanted to write about Nietzsche, for instance, and that really impressed me. I mention Nietzsche now and then, but I had a student that wanted to go and grab something that was one of the toughest things that I'd ever encountered in graduate school. So I had examples of very ambitious students that did things like that. Really, the best students in my experience were students that had a clear picture in their heads of what they were writing about, and they could express themselves clearly. Even if their ideas were not especially complex or profound, they could write it clearly. And a student that had the ability to write something clearly was far ahead. Just the ability to say something succinctly and clearly, that student was capable of rhetoric and persuasion. And that was always the most refreshing thing. Like the thing that I gravitated towards most with my students were the ones that were clear writers. I never gave my students multiple choice tests. My colleagues would ask me about this, my dean would praise me for this on occasion, and say that he didn't know why I did that to myself, why I read so much, why I forced my students to write so much. But if no one forced them to write, no one they weren't going to learn how to write. It just wasn't going to happen. They had to do it every time. So I never had a multiple choice test. It was always sentences, paragraphs, and essays. Every single test I ever gave. Um, and the students that could write clearly, they were always my best students, definitely.
So, Athenian, do you have any fond memories of students?
Yeah, just to sort of piggyback on that last thought of Bagby there. A lot of people fail to understand this, but one of the best professors, probably the best, really, that I ever had, he used to always tell us that the greatest thing that the university has to offer its students is the essay. Because when you teach, and he always required ours be very short. He would give us about a 1,200 to 400 page, I'm sorry, 1,200 to 400 kind of character, really, limitation. Sometimes he'd let us do 1,600 word count, not letter. That would be incredibly short. But that was the trick, was to get us to succinctly answer these very difficult questions in philosophy from the primary text with a limited amount of words. Uh, the worst essays that you'll ever read usually come from like history courses or things like that, where they assign something like, anywhere from 15 to 25 page essay, because students tend to pride themselves on being able to BS their way through, however many pages or whatever. But when you make it shorter, it really forces them to show you their cards. And I think he's right about that, because clear writing indicates clear thinking. And clear thinking is what every employer wants of their employees. That's just what we look for. And so I think he's exactly right about that. It's also why this chat GPT thing is so dangerous. But my answer for the best memories I have of students or things like that would probably be, it's sort of like kids. You're not supposed to have your favorite, but you end up having your favorite. And I remember when I was still a graduate student, I was teaching at a local school. It was a Catholic school, and I'm not Catholic, so I didn't really know anything about it. And the students, they had, it was that the stereotype of the kind of like the nuns coming in with like the rulers and slapping the kids on the students and stuff. They had a incredibly stern and powerful way of mandating and requiring discipline. And their dean of discipline was an old retired military vet guy, and he was great. And so the students were all just great, and they had me teaching everything from 7th grade all the way through 12th grade. And I remember thinking at the time I would hate teaching the youngest group, but I ended up enjoying teaching them the most, because they were still so pure. I mean, it was just so great teaching these young, like 7th grade kids and stuff, and they just had the highest amount of respect and decency, just really wholesome. And a group of my students that I ended up appreciating the most it was a family of these guys, and they were all wrestlers, right? Wrestling was real big in their family. And to this day, I still keep up with them. I mean, they're all married now and have families and everything. And I just love seeing what they've become. I mean, they haven't done anything with academia. They didn't really care too much about academics in the first place, but they were just really good people. And what they appreciated about me was that they saw in me that you could live the life of the mind and still be very athletic. And these things didn't by any means whatsoever have to work at cross purposes. In fact, they could complement each other in a very, very amazing way, to where you're in many respects at the highest of both ends of these things. And that really motivated them in their athletic career, with their pursuit of wrestling and everything like that. And I just think about those guys a lot, and I still see how they're doing, with their families and stuff on social media and stuff. Just really great group of guys.
So we have two more comments that I'll read quickly. One by friend of the channel, Luke Templar. Citizen by invite, citizenship by invite sounds cool. Maybe you're required to host them until they get a job. Only individuals, no corporations bringing in 5,000 people. Yeah, it's certainly an interesting thought there. And then John Carter, I wish my children could learn from TA. I think we know who TA is referring to. I won't bring up his name for obvious reasons. And then Trouble Armstrong for $2 Canadian. So I guess that comes out to basically 45 cents in real money. And this is a question specifically for Athenian, which is, what great book should you start with?
Oh my goodness. I would say probably, I'm just such a fan of Homer. I was fortunate enough to study Homer and Plato and Aristotle, really, but from just a truly amazing man. And what he used to always challenge us by saying, he loved to be provocative. Um, what he used to always tell us, I remember we were in a seminar on Plato's Laws, or it might have been a seminar on Machiavelli's Discourses. I forget. It was one of those. And he had this just beautiful way of showing how these great texts are in dialogue with each other, where he would bring up like Shakespeare or Homer. And he just paused one day and he said, when you think about it, everything is in Homer, everything. He said, but you have to know how to read Homer to find it. And trust me when I say, what he meant by everything was nothing less than the entire philosophical tradition up to even Martin Heidegger. And so he was able to, and he could show these things to us so seamlessly, where you would just think to yourself, I can't believe I didn't see this before. Just a really, really amazing guy. And so I like to point to Homer. Now, there's the question, well, Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey? I go out of my way every year to read both at least once. I like to be up to speed on my latest reading. There's no such thing as reading, by the way. There's only rereading, because as you read, you yourself become deeper, and you realize the things you missed before. But I mean, you certainly need to read the Iliad in many respects to understand some things that are going to happen that are very important in the Odyssey. But I'm more of a fan of the Odyssey. I mean, these things go together, but uh, I think there's more for young people, especially, to find, to really relate to in the Odyssey, with the element of adventure. And that's not to take anything away from the Iliad, though. I want to emphasize there's nothing being taken away here from Homer's Iliad, because these things go hand in hand. And like I said, I would be willing to bet, if I could speak with that professor again, he would probably back me up on this and say, well, if you know how to read the Iliad correctly, you'll find all of the Odyssey. And if you know how to read the Odyssey correctly, you'll find all of the Iliad. So there's my answer would probably be Homer's Odyssey, but either the Iliad or the Odyssey, you can't go wrong with it.
So gentlemen, we're coming up on time. If people want to find more of your work, Bagby, what's a good way for them to do that?
Well, I put an old book back into print, and I'm working on others. More news to come. If you look up Walter Fleming, George Bagby on Amazon, you should be able to find Walter Fleming's Civil War and Reconstruction in Alabama, which is a classic of Reconstruction history, particularly. I've republished that, and I'm working on others. I have a YouTube channel where I mostly read. It's just an audio channel, and you can find me there as well.
And I should say, I have your book linked. Your YouTube channel is well worth everyone's time. A mutual friend of ours, Semiagog, was asking for resources on dispensationalism and Zionism in the U.S., and I sent him a reading that you did of an article on the topic that was quite good. And so again, I highly recommend both of those. Those are linked. And so, Athenian, where can people find more of you?
Yeah, I have a website, athenscorner.com, where I do entire series on, for instance, technology and nihilism, Nietzsche's entire text, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I have a Fathers and Sons series where we're currently working our way through Homer's Odyssey, not the entirety, but the first 4 books with Telemachus. And I'm hoping to add a section also on. I have notes written up for just this great discussion series that I'm going to be doing on America itself, the reception of European philosophy in America, in order to better understand how it is that this thing we call the political left has gained this enormous ascendancy. Turns out it goes back prior to the founding itself, the kind of seeds for these things, and also one on Plato's Laws. But you can also find me on Spotify at Athens Corner. I'm on Apple as well, where I have, if not the entire lectures for free, some of them I do for free, some of them I just do the first half of them. And in fact, I just remembered, like, my most successful one so far has been the one I did on Homer's Iliad. It's like 3.5 hours. I thought that it was either going to be something great or a flop, but it ended up being that people loved what I had to say about the Iliad. I made it so long because I was like, look, this is the only discussion I'm going to do on the Iliad, because I'm doing so much on the Odyssey, so I'll at least do this one kind of long. And everyone seemed to really like it, and so I put that one in its entirety for free on Spotify or Apple or anything if you want to take a listen.
And I will say I am a paid subscriber to your website. It's highly worth everyone's time. I'm very exclusive about who I invite on for repeat appearances. Generally, that's a stamp of quality. And your work is incredible. I've really been diving into it, so I highly recommend that.
Let me just quickly add, for paid subscribers, an enormous amount of updates are coming. I've been in the middle of a move lately for the past month, so it slowed down just a little bit, but there is quite a bit that's coming, that's already recorded. It just needs to go through the tail end of things on the editing and the uploading portion. So it's coming if you're a paid subscriber.
And as far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I have a Substack, albeit one that is updated less and less frequently as things kind of continue to come up. If you want to support us most directly, the best way to do that is to check out Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. JD is very, very good at what he does and has been putting in a lot of work at making that business better. So now if you click my link, you'll actually go directly to a survey. And basically, as much information as you want to give, JD will use that to tailor a product specifically for you. And if you end up becoming a member, you get access to a private group chat with me and some other guys who are just absolute animals, like really incredible athletes and solid chaps as well. And I just want to thank both of you gentlemen for coming on. This was a great episode. And to everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.